Lynn, Megan and Josie Russell were violently attacked by a stranger whilst walking home from school. In an unprovoked and frenzied assault, the girls stood little chance. The killer evaded justice for a year. Eventually, a local psychiatric patient, Michael Stone, was arrested and charged with murder. A small consolation for the family and friends of the girls lost in this tragedy.
I look back at the photographs of all the flowers and the pets and the ponies and the little cottage, and it was a very lovely existence. Megan was never quite as outgoing or kind of full of herself as Josie. Josie was in a way, the leader, the oldest child. Megan was quieter, but very determined, just like her mum.
I can just remember two very bubbly little girls with a super mum and dad.
Lynn would be at home looking after the home and the animals. She did all her own work around the house, whether it was gardening, whether it was decorating, knocking down a wall with a sledgehammer. If she wanted to get something done, she'd do it.
I remember when I used to walk back with Josie and Lynn and Megan, I think they were quite laid back and very at one with nature, because I remember we would find things like a bird's egg or something and we'd take it home. Lynn would just let us do things like that, and yeah, it was nice just walking home amongst, the fields and things all pretty.
We were very settled. In fact, we were thinking of moving potentially to a larger place with our own field. We didn't have a field originally in Kent, but it sounds and was quite idyllic.
The attack on the Russells will be told through the eyes of those closest to the tragedy. A beautiful summer's morning in Chillenden, Kent. The Russell family rise and plan for a busy day, juggling work and school activities. They're beginning to find routine after moving to Kent from Wales just months previously.
Although I'd been trying to get a full-time job locally in North Wales, it hadn't worked out. We thought, for the sake of being together for the family, not having to do this long-distance commuting, we'd up sticks, moved to Kent. Okay, no mountains, but it's a very pretty, it's a beautiful place. There I remember it being very nice to be able to sit even outside in early morning before we went to work or school and have breakfast even on the little patio outside with the cats around and the dogs.
The Russell house winds into action with the usual family breakfast and plans for the day ahead.
That day I took the children into work myself, and that was one of the days in which I did deliver them to school. The thing I can remember about the last few minutes with Lynn was it was the normal morning rushing off to school, saying goodbye, the sunlight there and the garden, the flowers, and Lynn going off and me thinking, well, she'll be immediately getting stuck into the gardening or the housework.
Sean drives the short journey to the local primary school to drop his two daughters before heading to work.
I've got this vision, this image in my mind of them in their little blue gingham dresses with their satchels. They went to a swimming gala that day, I do remember that, so they may have had a couple of towels there as well, sort of draped over the satchel. So that's the last I saw as they went into school that day. Yeah.
As Sean settles into work, Lynn tends to chores around the cottage, and Josie and Megan start their daily lessons, unaware that in a few hours' time their lives will change forever.
I was Josie's teacher at Goodnestone Church of England Primary School. She was really bubbly, she was lively, she had lots of interests. A really very highly motivated child.
I first met Josie at school, when we were at school together. She and Megan were, the new children at school, and my friend and I, we kind of befriended her really. I remember all the children were going to a field to play, and Jasmine, my friend, and I stayed back with Josie, and I think we made like paper necklaces or something like that.
As the school day draws to a close, Sean nips out to the streets of Canterbury to run some errands.
To check on my bicycle, which was being fixed, get some cash, books that the girls had taken out from the Canterbury City Library. I returned them on their behalf.
Meanwhile, Josie and Megan are just finishing a swimming gala, as their mother Lynn makes the short, picturesque walk through the country lanes to pick them up from school.
I had phoned Lynn because she told me they were going to the swimming gala, and that she would then take them to Brownies. Lynn was going to take them along and be given a lift by a local friend. So when I did go home about 7 o'clock and they weren't there, I wasn't too worried. I just started making the supper for when they were due to come home.
As Sean prepares the family evening meal, he rationalises why the girls might be late home, until the phone goes.
It was Liz Gregson, and she rang and said that she'd called round at 5 o'clock to take them to Brownies and they weren't there. The house was closed up, there was no sign of them. At that point I started to become a bit concerned.
For the last half hour, Sean has presumed his family to be at Brownies, as planned that morning. Now, as evening sets in, he starts to panic.
You have no messages.
I didn't spend long on the phone with Liz. I do remember then starting to just try and work out where they might be.
My mum and I were picking her up and taking her to Brownies, and there was no one there, and obviously there weren't mobiles at that time. I wasn't too worried at the time, but when I was picked up from Brownies, Mum said that they still weren't back.
By the time Liz Gregson calls again, Sean is now frantic.
I believe it was around that time, 9 o'clock, that I said, right, actually, I better start making more of an effort to check on what's going on here. And I rang the police station. This is now only 2 hours after the time when we expected that I'd be home and maybe they would be home from Brownies. Police said no, we've had no reports of accidents. I suddenly thought, well, shall I go and have a look myself? I drove the route along the pathway, the little country lane, between our home and the school that Lynn and the girls would walk whenever they walked to and from school.
Girls, are you home? Lynn? Josie? Megan?
I actually also rang the vets in case they'd taken Lucy to the vet for some reason, which might be another reason that they hadn't called, you know, tied up with looking after the dog if it got run over or hurt. No joy there. Then I started ringing hospitals, mentioning the name, Russell. Have you had anybody brought in? You know, I was starting to get seriously worried by this time. There's a horrible possibility there might have been an accident, and the only reason Lynn wouldn't phone me is that she'd rushed to a hospital.
Look, John and I are going to John?
Sean now turns to the police once more. His family has now been missing for over 5 hours.
Said, look, now I'm frantic. I've tried everything. They're not back. This is not right. There can't be a woman and children wandering around in the countryside at this time of night without something being desperately wrong. Unbeknown to me, the police had taken my first call very early on, very seriously. they'd already started the ball rolling to do something and get a search team together and a dog unit and all that sort of thing without me even knowing.
Liz and John Gregson rush to Sean's side as a team of police officers arrive at Granary Cottage.
I was aware of quite a commotion outside with a van full of officers arriving near midnight, this dog unit turning up, and then basically fanning off into the countryside. They'd come over to the house. I sent a couple of guys over by 11 o'clock in the evening who were interviewing me by that stage, just trying to get information on what do they look like, what are their descriptions, if we're going to put out a notice. Also the inevitable questions about, you know, how's your marriage doing? Have you had an argument? Is there any reason that she might have taken the children, sort of thing, you know, which of course is rubbish, but you accept that they have a job to do, so you answer as best you can.
Sean is instructed to wait at the family home, while officers search surrounding countryside. Restless and now stricken with panic, he anxiously waits for some news.
They called Liz and John Gregson outside, and one of the two police officers, and explained to them what was happening, and then the other guy came back in, and I knew the moment I saw this policeman coming back into the house, his body language, the look on his face, that something terrible was wrong.
Sean Russell's wife and two daughters have been missing for over 6 hours. Lynn, Megan and Josie were last seen leaving school, but they haven't arrived home. Police have been out combing the countryside, and Sean now sees officers coming back to the cottage with news.
When you see that sort of thing in the movies, you know that the policeman's got the worst possible news, so I could tell straight away, and I just went hot and cold all over. Before he'd said a thing, I just knew that something terrible was about to happen, and he explained that it was the worst thing he'd ever had to do. He had some terrible news for me. It looked like there'd been some sort of accident, but that all the members of my family, Lynn and the two girls, had been killed. When the police team went out, it took them only a matter of minutes, because only a few hundred meters from the house, along this lane, was where the family were found, lying in the bushes there beside the road, the very same track that I'd driven up just a couple of hours before. The most that they said was something like, "There seems to be suspicious circumstances."
They found the scene, which of course was totally horrific to them, and it consisted of what the initial attending police officer thought were 3 dead people and the dead dog.
I remember vaguely just sort of going into an autopilot, numb feeling of half with it, half here, half not here, and gabbling out some questions about where were they, or why has this happened, what has happened. They said, "We're going to need to take you over to the nearby police station at Deal for some more questions, but do you want to get some sleep?" Liz and John were very keen, actually, to have me go back with them, sort of, as it were, take me out of the clutches of the police for a little while, at least have a rest, before starting the obvious questioning the following morning. I didn't want to have to feel I had to be polite or friendly or diplomatic, and I didn't want to be a burden to friends either. So I said, I'll come to the police station with you now.
As Sean's world falls apart, his friends urge him to rest with them, but rest is an unlikely solace. Instead, he presses to help police and heads to the station.
I do remember when I was away from Liz and John that I did get quite upset in the car going to the police station and shouting and screaming a bit. I do remember having sort of, I suppose you'd call it suicidal thoughts, because I remember saying things like, there must be an easy way out of this. Isn't there a sort of an inject? I made stupid statements like, you know, I'm sure there's a quick and easy way that one can be put to sleep with an inject, all that sort of silly stuff. But I guess I was a bit delirious by that stage. And I didn't know these three blokes in the car, and so there was nothing sort of holding me back on that journey through the dark lanes of Kent in the early hours of the morning when I was at my lowest ebb.
I was in bed and the phone rang and I was asked if I would go to the police station because there'd been a serious incident. And I was told when I got there, okay, well, your job is to go over to Deal Police Station where Dr. Sean Russell is, because his wife and children are missing. They haven't come home since school time. And so I went over there and I went with Ed Tingley, a policeman who was obviously tasked to speak to Sean and to get as much information as possible about the family's last movements. It was really important to get as much information as we could at that time.
Sean Russell has been told his wife and two daughters have died in suspicious circumstances. Officers are now anxious to piece together the tragedy.
I was met by two family liaison officers who'd been sort of pulled from their beds in the early hours. That was Ed Tingley and Pauline Smith there, who were to become great friends and supporters.
I just kept thinking, how would I feel if my own family hadn't come home? You know, I had been so devastated, as he was. I mean, he was just in shock, really, I think is the word.
And they actually said, don't you want to get some sleep? Here's a blanket, here's a cup of coffee, you just, you know, curl up here on a sofa in the police station and try and get a couple of hours of kip before we have to start the old statement taking in the morning, you know.
I hadn't actually had any specific training in family liaison work. In fact, there hadn't even been a course at that time. My actual role was that of a domestic violence officer, and previous to that I dealt with many incidents of child abuse and child neglect. I was on the family protection unit. So when I went, I didn't really know. I thought maybe I was just there to make the tea and offer the hankies and the sympathy. Of course, it was much later than that that I realised my role was going to change.
Sean begins the long and painful process of mapping out his family life. He needs to find answers to what has happened. 24 hours ago, he had a loving wife and two beautiful daughters. Now, everything has gone. Then an officer comes with news.
I was sort of half asleep when I remember Ed coming in and saying there's been a big development.
By this time, the family had been found and taken straight to the hospital. We thought everyone had died, including the family dog.
If you can help us, give us a description.
He said, we told you last night that we thought all your family members were dead, but we've discovered this morning that one seems to have survived. One of the girls seems to still be alive.
"24 hours ago, Dr. Sean Russell had an idyllic family life. Now his world is shattered. His wife and daughters have seemingly been found dead down a country lane. But in a sudden twist of fate, some news has just brought a ray of light.
The doctor was going about his business, and one of the police officers was there, and he noticed some flicker of life, and he called to the doctor. And the doctor jumped over and said, "No, you're right. This one's still alive. Get her to hospital." It kind of switched me from complete despair, sort of feeling of sort of suicidal ideas, I can't go on, there's no point to go on, suddenly to having a reason to go on at last, something to hold on to.
If you can help us.
I remember Ed coming back into the room and saying that he had this information for Sean, and Sean asking which one was it, and did she have freckles or not? And it was quite heartbreaking, really, because we didn't actually know at that time.
Sean now faces a traumatic journey to London to identify which member of his family has survived.
Even through the glass doors from outside ICU, and with all the masks and tubes and things, I could see some freckles on the top of the nose over the mask, and I knew that was Josie.
As Sean tries to come to terms with the fact that his eldest daughter is somehow clinging to life, the news of the tragedy is starting to trickle through to close ones in their village.
I remember waking up and Mum was asleep, which was really weird because she was always up before me because she started work really early. I remember being really excited that I'd woken up before her, and I rushed to get ready and went downstairs, and Dad told me that he had something to tell me and it wasn't very nice news. And I remember being told, and I kind of didn't feel anything. I think I was just numb. I think I was too young to really understand.
We all went into a state of shock. When you're a teacher, you're responsible, or you feel ultimately very, very responsible for the children in your care. It was actually a very difficult thing to tell the children, and I found it particularly difficult because two of my own two children were actually involved. My son was in my class, so I was telling my class and I was having to tell my son at the same time. And my daughter was in Megan's class, and we didn't know at the time which of the two children was actually alive.
Villagers are now waking up to a double murder in their tranquil surroundings. As police contain the crime scene, the media is already picking up on the tragedy.
I heard about it actually on the news in my car travelling to London. This was in the morning on the 10th, the day after the murder.
There was enough in that report that would have made close friends and relatives realise who the victim was.
We would suddenly find members of the media sort of coming from behind bushes and at the edge of the school playground, and we were just aware that there were lots of people around that we didn't know.
Well, certainly I've never known an investigation quite like this for the media involvement, which created a lot of issues.
I remember Ed looking a bit shocked. How's the news got out so quickly? Before we've even had a chance to tell everybody in the family. He said, "OK, here's a mobile phone, Peter and Irene up in Sutton Coldfield, Lynn's parents." And I could tell the moment I heard them on the phone, heard Peter on the phone, that he knew already.
As Lynn's parents are comforted, media interest grows by the minute. Meanwhile, police must establish what has happened as quickly as possible.
I went straight to the crime scene, which had been preserved, and then started to take control of the investigation from there. First of all, it's very important that we secure the scene forensically, so we can send our people in to get forensic evidence and to send scientists in. We then had to contain a much wider area because it was quite likely things had been discarded by the offender or offenders. One of my main concerns was finding out who witnessed this, if anybody, And the one person that obviously did was Josie Russell.
Josie now lies seriously ill in hospital, and doctors are unsure if she'll survive the night.
Kind of described it as feeling like at the bottom of a big dark pit, and like a prisoner in one of those old pit sort of cells, and just very dark and very gloomy, and with no hope of a future. But that changed instantly when I heard that Josie was alive, at least, even though I didn't know for how much longer she might be alive, or what state she might be in if she survived.
Police now face one of the country's biggest murder hunts. 3 people have been brutally attacked with no apparent motive. A killer is on the loose, and Sean's one glimmer of hope lies with horrific injuries. He now has an agonizing wait to see if she'll pull through.
By the end of that first day that Josie was in hospital, they'd carried out an operation of several hours, done a whole lot of tests. We were told she had serious head injuries, brain injuries. You know, she's on full life support. I had no idea whether she would survive at all.
Sean Russell's world has fallen apart. Less than 24 hours ago, he had a perfect family setting, a loving wife and 2 beautiful daughters. Now, he sits in the hospital, clinging to the hope his eldest daughter will regain consciousness. His wife and youngest daughter have been killed in an unprovoked attack.
I had no idea whether she would survive at all. I was still thinking, am I going to be asked for permission for them to switch the machines off, you see? Is she going to have any brain function, this, that and the other? Is she going to be a vegetable?
As Josie's life hangs in the balance, it is becoming clear to the police just how vital her recollection of the attack will be to the investigation.
Right from the start of this, Josie was uppermost in our mind. Obviously the first thing was her recovery and medical treatment. And we also had to consider her safety as well, because the offender was still at large and she was still alive and in hospital. So we had to look at protecting her. But running in tandem with that was, from an investigative point of view, is that she possibly could remember what happened and who attacked her and why.
The only surviving witness now lies in hospital. As officers watch over Josie's safety, doctors monitor her condition. Remarkably, and against all odds, they start to see a change.
It was that gradual progression from the lowest of the low, verge of death, intensive care, bit by bit coming out of it as the days progressed. I said, well, is she going to pull through? And he said, oh yes, there should be no worries about that. It was a bit of a shock, and a very, very welcome shock, very pleasing. She's going to have problems. She's got brain injury that have affected this particular area. She's likely to lead to speech and language problems, but possibly some physical problems, but she should come through. It may be weeks, months, but she should be back on her feet, you know, eventually.
This news comes at a vital point for officers. Josie is on the mend, but is delicate, and her injuries could become the barrier in telling her story. Yet police are no closer to catching the killer. They must find a way of communicating with Josie. Her evidence is now the crux of their investigation.
We had a number of people that we were looking at very closely, and they were eliminated from the inquiry.
Right, okay.
We made many appeals for information, specific information, general information, and that all came in thick and fast.
Maybe about mid-30s, I think. Right, okay. And do you know what time this was?
And each was analysed, and most of it turned out to be a blind alley.
We're now faced with a little girl who was at the murder scene, who may or may not remember, who held the key really to what had actually happened, because nobody could tell us. So I had to try and work out a way of how to extract all this information from her, and it was painstaking.
They had to, cut away these bits of bone and parts of the brain, which did eventually lead to some speech and language, reading, writing problems.
Eventually she started going to like a speech therapy class, and they would hold various pictures up in front of her. She'd kind of try to show you what she knew she was understanding, so we knew there was a bit of understanding there. We stayed with her constantly because who knew at any one time if she was actually going to speak? Of course, it was only after all the investigations on the surgery that, they were looking at what had happened to her that we realised the communication site of the brain had been damaged.
It's amazing to me to this day that they could predict, because of the area of the brain that had been affected, what the likely problems might be in the future.
Much to everyone's surprise, Josie's recovery is far quicker than anticipated.
6 weeks in hospital, and amazingly, that's all it was. 1.5 months, 6 weeks in hospital, from being on the verge of death to being able to go home. Even a couple of doctors talked about this is a miracle. That resilience, that strength, not only physical strength, which maybe most young children have, but sort of psychological strength was very evident. She was kind of like a battler.
Should we put this one in as well? That's Daddy and Mummy, isn't it?
I interviewed Josie and Ed did all the videoing, and I started to work on scrapbooks. I thought that would be a fabulous way really of testing her knowledge. I was able to build up all the things that led up to the swimming gala.
As Pauline and Ed gradually piece together the attack with Josie, their colleagues push to find other clues.
This became the most extensive and difficult forensic examination I've certainly ever dealt with in my career. If you've got a murder that happens in a room, you can seal it off and you can do all sorts of things that you couldn't in an outside location. It wasn't just outside, it was in a wood with trees and leaves, and it was in the summer where the leaves were full on the trees. And that meant lots and lots of surfaces, inappropriate surfaces to get fingerprints from, to get DNA from. So it was a very, very difficult scene.
She was obviously growing in strength, but she couldn't actually verbalise. So I thought by making models, it would give her an opportunity to really get off her chest what had happened, because, when someone is traumatised, generally need to talk about it, and she couldn't.
We found, with the help of a witness, some blood-stained toweling and clothing in a nearby location, and that proved very useful and allowed us to piece together what had happened. There was a hammer found close by this location, which was investigated very thoroughly. There is some doubt as to whether this hammer actually was part and parcel of the attack. But nonetheless, the post-mortem examinations clearly identified the murder weapon as a hammer. It was very frustrating in that hardly anything materialised from the forensic work.
As the months continue, police are frustrated by no major breakthrough. Josie continues to improve. She returns to school, and her statement could hold the key to the attack. All the while, the close-knit community in Canterbury are left in limbo, with a killer still in their midst.
Everyone was a lot more worried, for their children. Before, you could just walk down to the field and it wouldn't be a problem. And now there's this thought that there's this just psycho on the loose, and it's just not safe anymore. And this kind of pristine place where you once felt really safe, you just didn't anymore.
A lot of the parents actually felt the need to come and be with us all at school for quite some time actually. So many of them would just come and sit and have a coffee at the edge of the playground. And it served lots of purposes. They knew their child was safe, but also they were helping us to feel safe as well. It was a bit like a ripple in a pond. It sort of spread out because there are lots of little country schools in this area, and it made everybody question their safety.
For Sean, the tranquility of Kent has been broken forever. A few months after the tragedy, he moves Josie back to Wales. Meanwhile, the hunt continues, and everyone prays for some answers to Lynn and Megan's tragic death. As the months roll on, Josie manages to piece together that fateful day.
Christmas 1996, we were back in Wales just in time for Christmas. I mean, that didn't mean that the police work stopped. Ed and Pauline, poor guys, had to then do commuting up to North Wales.
Sean was desperate to take Josie back to where they knew, where they'd been living before. Josie was able to show us with the little models how they climbed over the gate or how they opened the gate for Lynn to walk through, and Josie really got into this, and we could see that she was really growing. Her knowledge base she was getting better and better, and she was able to start communicating more.
After months of rehabilitation and Josie's version of events, police now appeal for a second time to catch the killer. 1 year after the murders.
And that for the first time suggested that Michael Stone might be the offender, and he became a suspect very shortly after that broadcast.
At last, police receive a vital lead they've been looking for. A doctor could hold the key.
He was aware that this particular patient of his had been talking about things like this, and he gave a name to the police, which the police followed up.
When Michael Stone was first identified as a possible suspect, that then triggered an awful lot of investigative activity around him, his background, his movements, his ability to do this sort of thing, his mobility to do this sort of thing, his vehicle, so on and so forth. And that culminated in his arrest.
As Michael Stone is arrested, his background comes to light. He was a habitual drug user with violent fantasies who knew the area well. Claims he had spoken of the desire to kill shortly before the murders now come to the fore. But one question still remains. What was the motive?
We considered it may be robbery, it could be theft. There were other factors like the family dog was killed. Why? Was that just gratuitous violence, or was it done for a purpose? Because of the remoteness of the location, it did strike us that it was somebody that lived locally or somebody that had knowledge of the area. And the fact that a car was used suggested perhaps it wasn't immediately local, but somebody had travelled into the scene. If you put all those things together, there was no obvious motive that emerged.
After months of agonizing detective work and heartache for the Russells, they may now be a step closer to uncovering the murders. Michael Stone goes on trial a year after his arrest.
I asked them some things, but I didn't want to dig too far into their inquiry. When a person was found, it only sort of slowly built up, not all at once, that yes, this is the likely person.
It was a momentous thing to happen, but it left us with as many questions as it started to answer.
I wouldn't say that there was a sort of sudden sense of eureka. They found the person.
Stone is found guilty on 2 counts of murder and the attempted murder of Josie. He is given 3 life sentences. The devastating facts about the 9th of July 1996 now come to light.
The girls had gone to their swimming gala in Canterbury with the school.
Just finished swimming and we all came back on the coach, and then our parents would pick us up. And my mum picked me up in the car and Lynn was walking to pick Josie up.
Len had walked with Lucy, the dog, across the country lane, mile and a half away to Goodnestone to wait for them and collect them.
I knew obviously we were going to Brownies that afternoon, and Mum and I beeped the horn because we saw Josie, Lynn and Megan like just about to walk down the steps, and we thought, oh, we'll give them a lift home, and we beeped, and I remember we beeped quite a few times, and I thought it was really weird how they didn't hear us, and we just thought, oh, you know, that's fine, we'll just see her later. And if they had heard us, you know, then we would have given them a lift home.
They would have been chirruping away about the fun they'd had at the swimming gala, and they would have walked down Cherry Garden Lane, and that is when the whole event started to unfold of the person, as Josie described it, them passing a man in a car parked, and then as they walked down the lane, the car following them, etc., and then the attack ensuing from that.
The violence used was excessive, far more excessive than was needed to control the victims.
Probably the reason that Josie survived was that the damage to her skull was greater than to the other two. It meant the pressure on the brain that causes all sorts of damage was released naturally, and the cold temperatures of her lying for several hours sort of slowed down the development of the injury, and she probably pulled through because of the extent of the damage to her skull rather than the opposite. A peculiar paradox there.
The unprovoked hammer attack on the Russells raised wide-scale debate on the British laws and the strength of the Mental Health Act. Should it be reassessed?
It transpired that Michael Stone was one of these people that had suffered a very traumatic mental illness. He should never have been put in a position where he could actually do anything like this.
We know enough now that you probably could identify real at-risk, potentially violent people who ought to be taken into care and go through some form of treatment and drug control and this sort of thing. But there are people certainly on the civil liberties side who say, no, you can't go down that route, it's thin wedge.
People with mental health issues, I personally feel, are not really looked after that well.
There are experiments going on with people who are already in prison to see if particular lines of treatment can be followed for people who were previously classified as being untreatable. So this is still going on, and it's not clear what the outcome will be.
It would be wonderful if we had a magic wand and we could just wipe the evil out of this world. Unfortunately, we don't have that. We're not magic. And I think legislation should be changed and it should be moved on as these awful things happen.
Since Michael Stone's conviction, he has appealed twice and won a retrial. His attempts have failed. He continues to serve his sentence.
The next thing would be to say, you know, say sorry. I'm sorry I did it. Express remorse. It makes a big difference. You've always got that sort of lack of finality.
Sean and Josie's life is now very different. For years, they have humbled the nation with their resilience and courage to continue on with their lives.
We've been shown the depth of on one side, the worst side of human nature, but against that we've been shown the best side of human nature, all the people that took an interest in us and were so kind to us and generous and supported us through all of this. Okay, we had a mad, crazy, chance in a million, one-off thing happen to us.